Han Solo is, simply put, one of the greatest things about Star Wars, full stop. His character is what gives the original trilogy much of its charm. So it was a massive cultural moment when this iconic character, at long last, met his maker in The Force Awakens in 2015. Unfortunately, the actual scene and circumstances in which Han Solo dies felt somehow hollow, the image of his lifeless body falling into a bottomless pit, for some reason felt unceremonious for such a beloved character. So this got me wondering, what would have been the most dramatically satisfying way for the character Han Solo to die? Not just at this point in the saga, but at any point in the saga. What would have made the most narrative sense? Well, that is the question we'll explore in this video, and as we'll see, there are several strong contenders, some of which were actually considered by the film's creators during production. By the end of this video, I'll argue, using facts and logic, that there really is a right way of killing Han Solo, and once you've heard it, you'll understand just how wrong this scene really is. So first, a clarification. When I use words like right and wrong here, I'm not really talking about personal preference. I am actually suggesting that there are objectively right and wrong decisions in storytelling. That's because stories generally have their own internal logic. A character's actions have implications, and if this logic is violated, a story can feel incoherent. So, for example, it would be wrong if C-3PO turned out to be the main villain of the story, or if Leia chose to marry Jabba the Hutt. Extreme examples, yes, but they prove that as viewers, we all have expectations about how the story should or should not go. And it's that intuition that kicks in when we see Han Solo fall limply into that bottomless black pit. We all understand, as people sharing a common cultural understanding of this character, that however Han is supposed to die, this ain't it. So if we all have this deep intuition about what's wrong for the character, that should mean we all have the same intuition about what's right for the character. And that's what we're searching for in this video. And as we go, I'd like you to ponder the following question. Which character should Han's last words be spoken to? Is it Luke or Leia or perhaps someone else? Now, the way we can understand this is by understanding Han's character and how he fits into the broader story. Now, this trilogy is Luke's story, and Han is a supporting character in that story. The dramatic events in Han's story are counterpoint to Luke's story. I'm using the word counterpoint in the musical sense here. You can think of it like a secondary melody that plays underneath the main melody. In a way, it's less important, but without it, that main melody would be kind of incomplete. So when we ask what should happen in Han's story, we're ultimately asking how this story fits into Luke's story. And the answer is actually pretty clear. Han is first the cynic who doesn't believe in destiny or the Force.
It's all a lot of simple tricks and nonsense.
But who, by the end of A New Hope, has renounced his selfish ways and become a hero, turning up at the film's most decisive moment to give Luke the opportunity he needs to channel the Force and destroy the Death Star. It's a neat and tidy little character arc, but there's just one problem. It all takes place in that first film. And when the Star Wars saga was expanded in the ensuing 2 films, Han's character was already kind of resolved. So Luke grapples with these moral questions of evil and redemption. Han grapples with Ewoks. And so we can see the essential problem. Despite being an all-around great character, there's not a lot for him to do that is consequential to the main drama of the story. And well, if you're one of the people writing or portraying that character, that might get you thinking that the best use of the character would be to sacrifice him in the service of the bigger story. It's well known that both Lawrence Kasdan and Harrison Ford wanted the character to die. Ford hasn't been shy about this at all. He said it point blank to pretty much every late night host.
The best utility of the character would be for him to sacrifice himself to a high ideal.
Now, it's generally not advisable to let actors make key writing decisions about the characters that they portray. But in this case, Ford is onto something. He says very plainly that Han's death would give the story some, quote, bottom, meaning that it would deepen the drama and give it more substance.
I thought he should have died in the last one, just to give it some bottom, some
Did that not go over well
gravitas.
with George Lucas?
George didn't think there was any future in dead Han toys.
Now, leaving aside for a moment the fact that Ford was also concerned that he'd become typecast as Han Solo, I think Ford's reasoning is totally sound. But as we all know, he never got his wish in the original trilogy, and Han lives happily ever after surrounded by the Ewoks that he so adores. And that's because George Lucas never agreed with Ford and Kasdan about the fate of Han Solo. His reason was simple, that it would be simply too dark for what he saw as more of a fairy tale fantasy story. And so this raises the secondary question I'd like to address before the end of this video, and that is whether Lucas made the right decision in leaving Han alive. Now, Harrison Ford did eventually get his wish. In fact, some have speculated that this was a condition of his return to the franchise. So for better or worse, the death of Han Solo was written into Disney's first installment of the sequel trilogy. So towards the end of the film, Han comes face to face with his estranged son, Ben, aka Kylo Ren, who then skewers him with a lightsaber. Finn, Rey, and Chewie are there to witness it, and Leia senses that it has happened. And hey, look, I got emotional when I watched it for the first time, just because it's Han Solo. But like many others, I also felt unsatisfied. And as we know now, the sequel trilogy would go on to become a fairly incoherent story. And looking back, it's difficult to see how Han's passing was meant to fit into that story. He does return as a vision or a memory in Episode 9, which is interesting, and I suppose is meant to support Kylo Ren's redemption arc. But the bottom line is that there wasn't really enough of an on-screen relationship between Han and Kylo at this point in the story for this to really work as a meaningful, dramatic scene. Luke is notably absent from the scene and doesn't react until the next film, and even then they actually deleted the scene that showed his real emotion, I guess in order to save room for more important scenes. So with all that in mind, what are the most logical options for where this scene might have been better placed in the saga? Well, if you're looking at the original trilogy, I think there are 3 options. Let's go from worst to best. First, the climax of A New Hope. Now, one can easily imagine that when Han shows up at the Battle of Yavin, proving that his character is true and loyal after all, the Millennium Falcon would take heavy fire and be destroyed. What it would mean is that Han Solo not only redeems himself by joining the battle, but also sacrifices himself for a higher cause. Now, I think you'll probably agree that this doesn't really feel right either. In theory, his sacrifice would fit in here, but in practice, the tragedy would be misplaced, I think. It would change the tone of the film's climax so much that the battle would just feel deflated of all of its energy and potency. All you really have to do is imagine the medal ceremony at the conclusion of the film, and you realize that this really wouldn't work if there was a coffin there. Maybe 2 coffins if Chewbacca was on board. Yikes. So this option could really only work if the entire ending of A New Hope was completely different, and at that point we're just rewriting the movie. Now the next 2 options are much more plausible, and both options actually were considered very earnestly during production. The second option is the climax of The Empire Strikes Back, and of course that film does in a way end with a final goodbye to Han Solo. The reason for this is that Harrison Ford was not yet contractually obligated to return for a 3rd film, and so the whole carbonite thing was written as a kind of insurance policy in case he didn't come back. And despite the ambiguity of this cliffhanger, the scene does have an element of tragedy, and the film concludes on a somewhat mournful note. In some ways, it's the trilogy's darkest hour, with our hero at his lowest point. So it's really easy to imagine that Han simply dies at this point in the story, that Vader just goes full youngling on him or something. And in theory, the rest of the story would remain more or less intact. In fact, despite this film being considered one of the darkest episodes in the saga, it's one of the only films that does not see the death of an important character. So in order, you got Qui-Gon, Shmi, Padme, Obi-Wan, then nobody in Empire, except for this guy. Then in 6, we lose one of the most famous puppets in history, Jabba the Hutt, and Salacious B. Crumb. Oh, and Anakin. And then for 7, 8, 9, you got Han, Luke, and Leia, respectively. So the saga is an absolute bloodbath, except for Empire Strikes Back. In any case, losing Han at the end of Episode 5 would really cement Darth Vader as a brutal villain, and of course would make Luke's redemption of that character all the more profound. The only thing you'd have to give up is one of the best sequences in the trilogy, which is Han's rescue from Jabba's palace, so you wouldn't get Salacious or Bib Fortuna or Cy Snoodles, without whom Star Wars would just feel silly. Now, that of course brings us to the best option, which is the climax of Return of the Jedi. And this one really would elevate Luke's story in some interesting ways. The throne room scene is the climax of the saga, where Luke faces his ultimate test. The critical moment comes when the Emperor shows Luke that he has already foreseen the plan to destroy the shield generator, meaning that the rebels' plan to destroy the Death Star will fail. This is in part what fuels Luke's anger, leading to the critical dramatic moment in which he almost kills Vader. And one can imagine a scenario in which that anger is less about the failure of the rebellion or about Vader sensing that Leia is Luke's sister, and more about the loss of his best friend, Han Solo. There are many ways this could theoretically occur. Luke could sense that it happened down on the moon of Endor, but it would probably attain its maximum dramatic effect if Luke directly witnessed it. And for that to happen, he'd have to look out the throne room window as the Emperor, or Vader, orders the destruction of the Millennium Falcon, which might also mean that Chewie would have to go.
This deal is getting worse all the time.
Now, this would mean that Luke's rage would be much more immediate and personal, which in turn would mean that his ultimate decision to redeem the good in his father would be all the more morally profound. But the question still remains of whether this would make sense in the grand scheme of the trilogy. So was George Lucas's intuition correct that Han should survive? Well, it's a difficult question to answer because we're kind of speaking in hypotheticals here. And to be honest, I think I could be persuaded either way, perhaps in the comment section. But I will say that he's right that this would fundamentally change the tone of the trilogy. Losing Han would be deeply tragic and would change both Luke and Leia's characters irrevocably. It wouldn't exactly be a happy ending with cuddly Ewoks. And of course, toy sales would suffer from the film being less family-friendly. But in defense of George, it probably would overcomplicate Luke's ending, as he would then have to process two profound personal losses at once. So maybe it would be better if his character resolved more purely on the passing of Anakin. Now, there's still a lingering question in all of this, because I haven't yet described what Han's death should have looked like in the sequels, assuming that the original trilogy was unchanged. And now we're really speaking in hypotheticals, because in order to imagine this scene, we kind of need to wipe the slate clean and rewrite the sequels from scratch, which I know many people would like to happen. But to keep things simple, let's just assume we're talking about some alternative version of Episode 7. Now, I think if you just sit down and spend a few minutes writing this scene in your head, you'll quickly realize that Han's death scene really writes itself. There's just certain things that make objective sense, regardless of the plot of this hypothetical movie. Interestingly, when Harrison Ford talks about his own vision for how this character ends, he always says the character's death should not be accidental. He should sacrifice himself. And that's because it would complete the character's arc. The cynical smuggler makes the ultimate sacrifice for a higher ideal.
Did you want it to be a noble death then for Han at the time?
Preferably,
Yeah.
rather than an accident.
So let's say he takes a blaster hit and saves Luke's life or something like that. Importantly, he can't just die in that instant. His character deserves a farewell scene. Something like Boromir in Fellowship of the Ring. He gets a scene with Aragorn in which he's forgiven for trying to take the ring. He swears loyalty to Aragorn as king, and the emotion of that scene carries Aragorn's character into the next chapter of the story. That's what Han deserves. So the question is, which character is Han Solo's Aragorn? There are a few contenders for sure, but I'd like to lay out what I think is most strongly implied by Han's character. There are three characters who should be present for this scene: Luke, Leia, and Chewbacca, and each of them gets a brief interaction with Han. Now, this raises another interesting question. What order do they go in? And what's the content of their dialogue? Actually, why don't I give you a second to just imagine this scene in your head, and we'll see if we come up with the same thing. Okay, so first up is actually Luke. And you can imagine Han saying something like, "You're me, kid," coyly referencing the fact that they've saved each other's lives on multiple occasions. And Han would have to say at some point, unironically, "May the Force be with you," sort of like he does in A New Hope.
May the Force be with you.
Next up would be Leia, and they have a similar interaction, with Han's last words to her being a simple, "I love you." And what does she do in response? She smiles with tears, streaming down her face and responds, "I know."
I love love you.
I know.
That would just be a nice little bit of comic relief. But it would also have a double meaning because her confidence in his commitment wasn't always there. And now we would know that it is. And that leaves Han's last words for, man, I'm going to get emotional here. Yes, Han's last moment is with his best friend and loyal sidekick, Chewbacca, who has been by his side for much longer than Luke or Leia. And remember, Han's character is much less about the loftier ideas in Star Wars, destiny, the Force, and so on. He's much more about the basic values of friendship and loyalty. And though Chewbacca doesn't say much, their bond is clearly very deep. So yeah, as counterintuitive as it might seem, I think Luke and Leia actually take a step back for the final moment in which Han tells Chewbacca that he's free now, having fulfilled a Wookiee life debt for a life that is now over. And as we cut to the wide, framing all four characters, and as Han goes limp, what's the last thing that punctuates the scene? It can be only one thing. Chewbacca, holding Han in his arms, lets out a mournful Wookiee roar. And if there is a new character in our hypothetical sequel trilogy, he or she can be there to witness this, but they should be over there somewhere. Influenced by the scene, yes, but from a respectful distance. Now, I'm sure many will have their own version of this scene in their headcanon, and I don't mean to suggest that mine is the best. I just think it's interesting to consider how good Han Solo's final scene could have been had it been given the respect it deserved. And you know, all that was really needed was to look at the character and extrapolate from the original trilogy what his ending rightfully ought to be. I don't know, in the end, maybe George Lucas's intuition was correct after all, that for some types of characters, despite the temptation to see how it all ends, a wiser storyteller knows when to live and let live. So thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.